Hello, welcome to AP Sources Simplified. Today we're looking at the Immigration Act of 1924, which also includes the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act. Before getting into the details of the act, let's take a look at the context. From the mid-1800s onward, there was a substantial amount of immigration to the United States. Immigrants came from all over, and there were both push and pull factors bringing them in. Some were being pushed out of Europe and elsewhere due to political instability in the forms of revolutions and wars. Sometimes it was because of famine, most notably the Irish potato famine. And there was also a lack of available and affordable land in parts of Europe that were becoming overcrowded. There were also factors pulling immigrants to the United States, like the overarching factor of opportunity, and more specifically, available jobs, land for cheap, especially because of the Homestead Act, and for some to simply escape persecution in their home countries. Prior to the 20th century, there had been attempts to curb immigration. In the 1840s and 50s, a political party sprung up advocating against immigration called the Know Nothings, or American Party. And then in 1882, because of increased immigration from China, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which banned all immigrants coming from China. However, that ban, and immigration in general, was lightly enforced throughout the 1800s, in which you could say that America had nearly open borders. In the 1920s, immigration policy began to change, with the government taking a hard line on the topic. This decade saw the resurgence of conservatism and rampant xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners. Many in the U.S. felt the identity of the country was changing for the worse because of the influx of immigrants. Eugenicists argued in favor of keeping the gene pool from being tainted by less desirable immigrant groups. Some worried about the influx of Catholics changing the Protestant nature of the country. This also helped the rise of the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, which would boast millions of members, and they advocated for the preservation of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority, also known as WASP. These forces propelled the Strict Immigration Act of 1924 to passage. First, let's take a look at the Asian Exclusion Act. There were many complaints from citizens and politicians on the West Coast about Japanese immigrants. They saw Japanese immigrants as failing to integrate, and there was also rampant racism against them. While President Coolidge had some reservations about signing this part of the Immigrant Act, partly because of protests from the Japanese government, he still would do so, which this act effectively banned all Asian immigrants, with the exception of the Filipinos, since that was a U.S. territory. The overall Immigration Act only allowed for 165,000 immigrants per year, which is a sharp decrease from previous years, and it made so immigrants from certain regions, specifically Northern and Western Europe, were favored over immigrants from elsewhere. While Congress had access to more recent census data, they chose to peg the numbers to the 1890 census, 34 years prior to the act. So the Immigration Act would only allow what was 2% of the U.S. population from an individual country at 1890s levels. For example, this act, it would only allow for around 3,500 Italians compared to 34,000 British people to immigrate a year. At the time, there were many Italians immigrating to the U.S., and the act would have a great effect on limiting them and other Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans from entering the United States. One side note, this act does exclude those from the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America and the Caribbean. Finally, the bill provided funding and provisions for immigration courts to carry out the act. The overall purpose of the act is quite clear, and the State Department of the United States does not hide from it, as the department stated the intention is to, quote, preserve the ideal homogeneity, which meant to keep the U.S. white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant majority. Many in the United States would agree with the bill. Almost all of Congress voted for it, and at the time, the powerful KKK definitely supported it. Labor organizations and the main leader, Samuel Gompers, supported it as well, as less immigrants meant less competition for jobs and hopefully higher wages. And of course, anyone who feared foreigners or a changing American identity due to immigrants supported it. Those who disagreed would have been recent immigrant communities. Jewish organizations in particular protested the bill because America was seen as a refuge for the persecuted group. Finally, looking at the legacy of the act, it has gone down as one of the hallmarks of the 1920s, While some see the 1920s as an era of progressivism because of flappers, jazz music, speakeasy cultures, and the like, outside of big city thrills, it was actually an era of conservatism and anti-immigrant attitudes. It fits right in with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the Scopes monkey trial, the anti-immigrant fervor over the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and the continuing eugenics movement. In terms of practical effects, the act did curb immigration overall, and did so drastically from Southern and Eastern Europe. Later on, the act would be amended in 1952 and replaced in 1965. Okay, that does it for the Immigration Act of 1924. If you liked the video, please click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends.